We ready? This thing's on, right? Welcome. This talk is called Front-End Development for Back-End Developers. The reason you might have seen something different on the conference agenda, that was front ends for back-end developers. And if you look at the abbreviation for that, it's FEBED. That's kind of a funny term, right? FEBED. So I wanted to change it to FEDBED because that sounds a little bit different. That's the only reason I changed the title. So my name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana, which is a northern state in the United States. I had no electricity. I had no running water for 16 years. And I had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop every day. And so it sounds terrible, but it was actually pretty nice. And I really didn't care about not having electricity or having a TV or anything like that until I went to my friend's house when I started getting a school age. And I realized that, wow, they had TVs and toilets and stuff. I mean, that sounds pretty nice. So it was a very interesting childhood. And I work for a company called Okta. So Okta is basically users in the cloud. But if you look at the abbreviation for that, it's UASS. So like UAS, that's not a very good abbreviation, right? So I try to say UMass instead. And we basically provide an API that you can talk to authenticate your users, get access tokens, and use standard protocols. But the real reason I like it is in the San Francisco headquarters, they actually have a bar in the office. So they call it the Okta Pub. And I'm a remote worker. I work in Denver, Colorado, and I travel to San Francisco once every quarter. And guess where I work when I'm there? I work at the bar. So we have a number of authentication standards we support: OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and SAML. And basically, if you're going to write authentication on your own, you might do it wrong. You might not be encrypting your passwords and doing things that way correctly. So we can help you. And basically, for developers, it's free to use. You get up to 1,000 users, and you could easily put that into production as well. So now I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. How many consider themselves back-end developers? So that's 90% of the room. Good. Anyone consider themselves a front-end developer? None. That's perfect. You're my right audience. How many people are doing Java? Okay, 90%. Anyone doing .NET? We got 2 in the back. Python? We got 2, 3. Anyone doing Node.js? We got about 5. Okay. Do you currently write code for UIs? Even if you write JSPs or anything like that? Okay, that's about 10 or 15. Who likes JavaScript? With like 4 hands. Who doesn't like JavaScript? Like all the rest go up. Okay. Anyone using React? Anyone using Angular? Angular.js? Angular 4. Okay, those are about even. And anyone using Ember? Nope. Anyone using Vue.js? We got one. He's like half hand of it. Okay. So my web development journey, I actually started writing web pages in 1993. And I don't know if you remember back way then, there wasn't even a proper browser. There was this thing called Slipknot. Netscape 1.0 haven't even been released, so I started doing HTML and everything before that. And so once we actually had HTML that would render images with Netscape 1.0, I was like, wow, this is cool stuff. And then I started doing Java in the late 90s, and I got into open source and struts in 2001. I wrote the first book on Spring in 2004, and then I started getting into comparing web frameworks and MVC frameworks in Java land in 2004 through 8. And I really got into doing a lot of back-end development with Spring because I had written the book and people wanted to learn about that. But my real love was always in the front end. So in 2009, I got back into the front end, started doing GWT, and I did GWT for a year. And then I spent doing a year of leadership, and then I did Java at Overstock.com in the US. And I also did a bunch of jQuery and Angular at Taleo. And basically since 2014, I've been on or off with Angular and AngularJS most of the time. I've also dabbled in some other frameworks, but today my favorites are basically Java, Spring Boot, Angular, and TypeScript. but I really like skiing and driving Volkswagens more, but I do like programming as well. So the big question is, what is modern front-end development? So raise your hands if you think it's JavaScript. Like 2 reluctant hands go up. Really, I think it is. TypeScript. Okay, we got a few more. Is it CSS? Who here is good at CSS? It is like the one very unique skill that I have is I'm good at CSS. Like, if you give me something and say, hey, this is what it looks like, can you make it look like this? I can do that with CSS. So I've always said that when people ask me, what's your most unique skill? I'm like, CSS, baby. So front-end development has changed a lot since 2005. If you look at this slide, you'll notice that there were some big releases in between 2004 and 2005. That's when we got JSF 1.0, we got Spring 1.0, and Flex 1.0, like all in that same time period between like March and April of that year. And since then, it's just been kind of crazy. I mean, who remembers the good old days of struts and Spring MVC back in 2004, 2005? And then how many people did we have that jumped on the JSF bandwagon? We got like 3. How many of you are still there? Who likes JSF? So you guys weren't the ones that answered this survey, because Zero Turnaround started publishing this Web Frameworks Index, and you'll notice JSF is right up there among Java developers. So there's a lot of people that are apparently using it and like it. It's crazy that it's still around, right? And used quite frequently. So then came the JavaScript explosion, right, in the JavaScript framework. So they used to laugh at us in Java land because we had so many MVC frameworks. I think we were up to 100 at the time. And now there's like, I don't know, 200, 300. Just wait a few more minutes. There'll be another one, right, in the JavaScript framework land. And so it's really become somewhat overwhelming. And this is a great post on how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. Like, you're really excited to start it, and you're really excited to learn, and then you have to install Node. And then you're on Windows. And then, like, all these things go wrong before you can actually even get to writing code and developing your app, right? And so it's a really funny post. If you haven't heard it, I highly encourage you to. And all these slides from this presentation I will be turning into a PDF and posting online, and I'll give you a link to that in the end. And so some of the slides actually have links in them on the images that you can click on and go to it. So you don't feel like you have to write down the URL right now. I will provide that at the end. So it was a great time to be a programmer back in 2004 and 2005, right? You could, as a Java developer, write these web apps with struts or Spring MVC, and they just worked and no one really cared. And I think what you have to realize is at that same time, you were really excited to learn new technologies. And you were really curious about what these technologies can do. So even with all these JavaScript web frameworks, I think you have to have the same attitude. You have to be curious, and you have to want to learn. If you do that, you'll probably feel like Homer, where you're like, look at all the stuff we get to learn. Like, this is so great. So that's the attitude I want you to take throughout this talk, and even from here, is be curious, try things, be okay with learning. So let's do some learning. Before you actually get into a lot of the front-end development, it's important to understand there's different types of JavaScript. There's ES5, there's ES6, there's ES7, and there's TypeScript. And those are all, you know, one layer above each other. So ES5 was released in 1999. You know what else was released in 1999? IE6. And in 1999, that was an excellent browser. It could do all this stuff that the other ones couldn't. Of course, we didn't expect it to last till like 2014. But ES5 wasn't released until 2009, or ES4. So ES4 was released in 1999, ES5 in 2009. And then ES6 has come along, also known as ECMAScript 2015. And basically what ES6 has given us is a lot more robust JavaScript in the sense of we can write classes and modules and imports, and it looks more like object-oriented programming. So ES7 is technically ECMAScript 2016. It was finalized in June of last year, but its only features are like an exponential operator, which is star star, and the ability to find out if an array includes some other objects. So it's not, you know, a lot of new features in there. The one feature that ES7 did have was called a decorator. It looks a lot like our annotations in Java, but they took that out. But TypeScript, if you use TypeScript, it gives you those decorators, so you can still use it. And TypeScript and ES6 both have transpilers to compile down to ES5, so it works in any browser. So you can see here on caniuse.com, ECMAScript 5, supported all over the board. ECMAScript 6 classes, not in IE11, and not in Opera Mini. But who cares about those anyway, right? People are still using IE11, but Microsoft is pushing hard to get people to use Edge, so at least Edge supports it. But then there's this other thing called modules, right, which allows you to like group everything together. That support is really bad. So Chrome doesn't even support modules. You'll see there Safari does, and iOS Safari, but pretty much no one else. So with TypeScript, you can actually download the TypeScript compiler and install it, and you can see here how you might write a function. You know, and you're still writing JavaScript. It still is ES6 or even ES5. You can do that. But what it gives you is it gives you types. And the biggest difference you might notice on that greeter function is that it's variable name colon type. And in Java, we do type space variable name. So that's probably the hardest thing to get used to. But if you're using tools like IntelliJ, it'll actually figure out a lot of those things for you and prompt you. It'll do the imports for you. And it's really a great tool for doing JavaScript. And then you can see the TSC greeter.ts is how you compile that into a file that any browser can understand. So this example right here is straight from the TypeScript language documents in their tutorial there. The other things it gives you is some additional types. So with JavaScript, you have number, you have string, you have Boolean. TypeScript will give you a tuple. It'll give you an enum, an any type, and a void type. And then it's also got like interfaces. It's also got generics. And it really brings a lot of power to the tooling, right? Because they can use IntelliSense and they can figure out, you know, what methods exist on a class. They can do the refactoring. And even cooler, you can run the TypeScript compiler on existing JavaScript and find out if you named variables wrong or anything like that. So if you look at this bus class, for instance, you can see there, this doesn't look like your normal JavaScript, right? This is ES6. It has that export class, which is kind of like saying, hey, this class is public, and others can use it. It's got a constructor, which is spelled out as constructor. It uses the Elvis operator there to basically say this is an optional parameter. And then the get and set are keywords, and so you don't actually call getters and setters like you do in Java. You just say bus.name equals. That calls the setter. You do bus.name without anything, and that calls the getter. That's just how it works. And then we got some string interpolation down here that actually allows you to put variables in your strings as long as they have backticks in them. So TypeScript 2.3, this is an example of using VS Code that allows you, this is a regular JavaScript ES6 class, and allows you to just put a comment in there that says TS check, and it'll actually look and find all the things that you did wrong. So we're not writing TypeScript here, but the TypeScript compiler allows us to basically check our JavaScript. And so to do JavaScript development, you'll need Node.js. It's pretty easy to install, especially if you're not on Windows. Typically works well on Windows, but it is the source of the most problems that it has, which is similar to a lot of, I guess, programming platforms. There's also NVM, which is a handy tool. NVM allows you to switch between node runtimes. And so if you're just doing front-end development, this probably isn't a big deal. But if you're doing back-end development with Node, chances are you might have one product on one version, one product on another version. Similar to in a Java project, you might have one that's on 7 and one that's on 8. So once you have Node installed, you can start using front-end tools to actually build your system. The old thing was Grunt. That's gone now. You can forget about that. Gulp is still kind of old. The new one that a lot of the Angular examples use is System.js. But the Angular CLI and a lot of modern projects that have been updated and refactored in the last 6 months are using Webpack now. And Webpack gives you a lot of abilities to do like code splitting and basically takes anything, whatever it is, and outputs whatever you want. So you can have CoffeeScript that goes to JavaScript. You can have TypeScript that goes to JavaScript. You can take your PNGs and optimize them. You can take your CSS and concatenate it. You can take your Sass and compile it into CSS. For web dependencies, the old school one was Bower. People used to use that to download all their JavaScript files. The new school is NPM or even Yarn. Yarn is much faster than NPM. It does a lot of caching outside of your actual process. So in the Java world, we have Maven, and people made a lot of fun of us for Maven because it downloaded the internet. Well, NPM downloads the internet, all their friends, and then says, come on over for the party, right? And if you look at most projects, especially in the JavaScript world, the node modules directory is so much fun to do account lines of code on, because you'll find there's Lisp and Python and all this kind of stuff in there, and it's well over 1 million lines of code, even for an Angular starter project. And that's because basically they don't have much versioning in the package structure and the file system, so everything gets rewritten over it when you upgrade to a new version. So there are better tools coming out. I hear that NPM 5 is going to be faster than both Yarn and NPM. And there's also PNPM, which does a lot of the Maven style where it's caching things outside of your project. So you might want to look into those. And one of the things you'll notice from this, if it's a good build tool, it'll actually have a logo. So if you guys are going to build a new one, make sure and have a logo with your build tool. But then there's also the Yeoman workflow. And what Yeoman does is allows you to generate applications. So it'll basically allow you to construct a template, and then you generate applications. And this has actually been very popular for the last couple of years. Basically, it has 3 different types of tools. It's got building the web app, the scaffolding tool, which is called Yo. You basically say, Yo, build me an app, which is the coolest command ever, right? And then the build tool, which can be Grunt, Gulp, Webpack, or whatever. And then the package manager like NPM to download all your stuff. So it makes it very easy to install new libraries, create projects, and then it usually has testing with Karma or Phantom.js. And so that's great. And what's kind of happened in that arena is people are starting to move to their own CLIs. Angular has their own CLI, React has their own CLI. Even JHipster, we have a new CLI in there. So people aren't typing Yo as much. They're just typing create new app or ng new or something like that. So even though Yo is still maybe used under the covers, it's kind of being hidden more and more by these CLIs. So Browsersync is one of the best tools. And I don't think I have sound, but there might be a video here that you can see. It basically allows you to change an HTML file, a CSS file, or even a JavaScript file, and it'll refresh in all your browsers. And one of these is even an emulator, right? So even if you're running iOS simulator, it'll still refresh that one. And it's just a great tool to use. It really promotes fast development. It allows you to get in the zone and just write code and not worry about distractions and not worry about reloading and testing in all your browsers. The one thing it does promote as well is not to test from the code perspective, right? Because you're testing in the browser all the time, it's working. So try not to do that. You should still write JavaScript tests, even though your workflow is so easy that you can manually test it. So with Gulp, it kind of looks like Ant. You basically write tasks. For instance, here's how to do a serve with Browsersync, and you basically point it to where your files are, and then it watches for any changes in those files. If it happens, then it reloads them. Webpack is basically a module bundler for modern JavaScript applications. You can see there all these different types of files it outputs into other static assets. So it processes your application, recursively builds a dependency graph that includes every module your application needs, then puts out a number of smaller bundles. So it can also do code splitting and allow you to lazy load some components of your application. So that's one of the reasons it's become so popular. It's also incredibly configurable, and it has 4 main concepts: entry, output, loaders, and plugins. So if you look at a typical Webpack config file, it has an entry point that says, hey, here's where I want everything to start from, an output, here's where I want everything to end up, and here's some module loaders. So this is an example of using Raible to take ES6 and output ES5. If you were doing TypeScript, you would have an awesome TypeScript loader is the name of it. If you're doing Sass, you would have another loader that processes it. There's other ones that you can do with plugins like string replacement. If you want to put the version of the current project into your output, you could do it that way. Some cool Webpack features are the Webpack bundle analyzer. that will tell you where the big parts of your application are. For instance, one of the things you might want to do is split your vendor bundle and your application bundle. So Angular, React, or whatever it is in a separate one because that doesn't change much. And then yours is in a separate one. And if you want to split yours into much smaller ones, this will basically give you a visual of how you might do that. There's also the Webpack dashboard, which shows up in your browser and tells you exactly where something went wrong. Actually, not in your browser, but in your console. Right? So it gives you more information than just a stack trace that tells you something failed. So I wanted to tell you about this practical introduction into Webpack in 3 parts. This just came out this month, and I believe the first part has been released. I don't know about the second part yet, but basically it's telling you how to get to know Webpack and how to do it in a very simple manner. So this guy, Ivan Akaluf, a senior software engineer at EPAM, has done this. And it's basically his goal to show you that he's written hundreds of thousands of lines of front-end code. He really knows Webpack well. Here's an easy introduction to it. But the coolest part is we're back to compiling. And so we can go for coffee, and we can wait. And so it's funny, I think, that JavaScript now takes longer to compile than Java. All right? How did that happen? Who knows? So there's a bunch of leading JavaScript frameworks in 2017. Most of these are from my opinion and my gut feel. Like I think Angular is one of the more popular ones, along with React. And then I think Vue.js is becoming a strong contender. And so it's funny, I talked about with some people at work that I thought these were appropriate, and they said yes. And I said, what about like Ember or Meteor? And they were like, I don't see a lot of traction for that based on website stats and what people are searching for. And then I found this article by Eric Elliott where he basically says the same thing. So what he says is Angular and React dominate. So if you're going to choose to learn one, you should learn one of those. My advice is why not learn them both? It's not terribly difficult to learn them both, and they both have very unique concepts. If you're familiar with AngularJS, Vue.js is a simple transition. So I think that's why they've gotten a lot of people interested in it. And React, at the same time, Angular 2 took so long to create that I think a lot of the people doing AngularJS were like, I've had these problems with code splitting and with building large applications. Is there a better way to do it? And they found React. So both of these communities benefited from Angular taking so long. If you look at jobs on Indeed, I searched for a framework name without a .js plus JavaScript. So I put a space in there, and that's how I found these stats. You can see that Angular dominates. I threw Aurelia in there because that one got a lot of press about a year ago, and they've had similar likings to Angular, but there's still not people hiring for it much. You can see that Backbone and Ember and Knockout, especially Backbone, there's a lot of maintenance programming to be done there if anyone wants a job. Stack Overflow, up until last month, Stack Overflow actually redirected Angular to AngularJS. And so only in the last month have they split those into separate tags, and this is just Angular. So if I threw AngularJS tag count on here, it would be way higher. So you can see based on that, it's pretty popular. Stack Overflow Trends was just announced last week or earlier this week, and they basically show trends on Stack Overflow of what's been popular over the years. You can see that jQuery used to be among the most popular tags. There's an extraordinary amount of growth in AngularJS, but all those are waning, and Angular's picked up as well as React. So those are both trending upwards. GitHub Stars, this is where developers are, right? This is where people have GitHub accounts and they've taken an interest in a project and start it. So I think this really points to why you hear a lot about React and Vue is because developers are trying it a whole lot. So Hello World with Angular looks simple enough. Right? You basically have a component or a decorator up here. You have a selector, which matches what we have in our HTML down here. And you have a template with backticks, so we can put a variable in there. And then you basically pull the name into there, and that's Hello World. So that's less than 10 lines of code. Not too bad. But then you need a module. So this is what you need. You have an app component that gets imported from the previous one. You bootstrap stuff. You import stuff. You have to declare that component, and then you have another main.ts, which bootstraps everything. And so even though it's pretty simple to do Hello World, still requires 3 files. Or actually, you could do it all in 1 file, but 3 different classes. So the easiest way to get started with Angular is Angular CLI. And this is a NPM dependency that you install, and then you can ng-new a project. And it basically creates a lot of the infrastructure that you'll need. I think there's about 25 files that are created. You have your test runner with Karma. You have Protractor set up. And you can basically start generating your components. Now, you can write your components by yourself, or you can generate them. So it allows you to generate components, generate services, and it creates that basic structure for you. So here's what it looks like. You do ng-new, creates my cool app. You can see all the files it creates, and then Protractor, and it basically installs everything. And in this instance, it happened in 37 seconds. When I tried it earlier today before my workshop, it took just over 4 minutes. So it's very dependent on your network connection and how fast that is. So after we did that, we ran ng-serve, it compiles everything, and that's it up and running. So I created a screencast so you could visualize that. And I sped it up so it wouldn't be too painful. Right, that took 1 minute and 31 seconds, but I made it look like it took 10 seconds. And then you run it, compiles everything, serves it up. So to get started with Angular, of course, you have the Angular CLI, but there's the quick start on the main documentation site. And what they do there is they link to a plunker that's already got everything set up so it doesn't seem too painful. There's also a couple different Angular seed projects. The first Angular seed one has I18N support. It's even got Docker support and support for Angular Mobile Toolkit. The Angular seed advanced has like internationalization built in. It's got native script if you want to do mobile apps. And it's got Electron support if you want to actually bundle your app up in a Chromeless browser and distribute it as a desktop app. Some apps that use Electron that you might be familiar with are Slack and, what's the other one, Atom from GitHub. Both of those use Electron. So they do end up sometimes using a lot of memory, but you are bundling Chrome and running Chrome like in this headless system. If you want to learn more about Angular and Angular CLI, this ng demo project I created is a huge long tutorial, like 20 or 30 pages, that shows you how to do everything from building to testing and to deploying to continuous integration, deploying to Cloud Foundry, as well as integrating with Okta. We have an OpenID Connect client, or it's actually not ours. I just integrated this one from Manfred Steyer, which is Angular-OAuth2-OIDC, and that's pretty easy. What I highly recommend is if you're interested in OpenID, OpenID is built on top of OAuth 2, and it's really promoted by Google a whole bunch. This YouTube video is done by the founder of OpenID Connect, and he's got the smoothest voice that you've ever heard. And so you watch it for like 5 minutes, and at the end you just feel like you had a breath of fresh air or a massage or something like that. You're like, man, I kind of want to watch that again. So if you know Angular, there's also Ionic. Ionic basically takes everything that's in Angular and then bundles it up and makes it into a PhoneGap or a Cordova app that you can install on your phone. And it looks like a native app. There are certain things that might not happen quite as fast, but it's really developing rapidly, and that works really well. So on the Okta developer blog, I've written a post on how to actually take and develop an Ionic app, and you can deploy that as a progressive web app, or you can just install it on your phone. So it's not quite there yet, but hopefully it's there by the end of the day or maybe tomorrow. Learning about Angular is really effective with the NG Book 2. You'll notice that even though it's called NG Book 2, it's a comprehensive guide for Angular 4. So they chose to keep the same name for the book because there wasn't that many changes between Angular 2 and 4. You might ask what happened to Angular 3. Nobody knows. No, they just skipped it because Angular Router had a bunch of version increases, and they wanted it all to be the same version. So they skipped Angular 3. So with React, it's a little bit different. You'll notice here's Hello World with React. A lot less lines of code, right? But I also didn't show how to import or anything. This is a code pen for it. Basically, you'll have a div ID, and then React DOM, you'll render into that. The most interesting thing or unique thing about React is the fact that you embed HTML. There's no quotes around anything here, and so when it compiles, it'll know if you have invalid HTML in there. So it's kind of going back to the days of JSPs when we had a lot of Java code embedded in our template. But this is taking off like wildfire, so a lot of people like it. My favorite React video is this one from Eric Vicente in the Intro to React workshop. He just did this at this year's Facebook conference, and it's awesome. Like, it's an hour long. He has a GitHub repo that goes with it, and you can basically follow along very easily and see how to create a React application. And it's very well done. It's almost inspiring. Like, if you're going to do a screencast, instead of like typing out commands really fast or something like that, it's almost cooler to have a GitHub repo that you copy and paste from, because then other people can kind of follow along. So it was a lesson for me just watching it. So imperative code, normally that people have done with jQuery, typically you add elements, you modify elements, you'll move elements. So it's very verbose. Managing transitions and states can get really hard. And it describes how to change the UI, but you have to do a lot. So this is an example of Facebook's icon for notifications. And so I didn't know this, but apparently if you get more than 99 notifications, you get fire on it, right? Because you're on fire. Like, a lot of people are liking your stuff. So this is how you would do that. And if you do it with declarative code in React, it's much simpler because you're just returning right away. So if you look at this one, we don't even get to the first return until way down to the bottom. And here, we're returning what it is right away. Not only that, but React is smart enough to know that this was already there, and all it needed to add was a span. So it's almost like Git and how it can diff your changes and then merge the changes in there. And so that's why it's really fast. And it works really well when you basically have a lot of state that changes on your UI. So you can see that with Facebook, where the timestamps on everything are changing, the notifications, the comments, like all that's going on. So if you have a UI like that, you might want to look into React. So they have a similar CLI as Angular does. This one's called Create React App. You basically npm install it, you run Create React App, you cd into it, and you run npm start. And so that is similar to how long it takes with Angular CLI. You can see here it prints out the commands for you to use, though. And you basically type Create React App. You generate your application. And most of the time, as with most of these, is spent installing your packages. But it uses Yarn by default, so that's pretty cool. Angular CLI actually does too, but not the first time. After you've done it once, then it prompts you the second time and says, do you want to use Yarn by default? So one of the coolest features is it ships with documentation. So the README file is just enormous, and if you check that into GitHub, you have full documentation on how to do everything within your project. Of course, you can read it in a Markdown reader on your local environment as well, but I think it's a great feature. Even though developers don't read documentation, at least you can say, like RTFM. Hello World with Vue is pretty simple. You can see here we have a div ID. And how it works is Vue, you'll initialize it, and then you'll tell it where to bind to. So it's just using traditional CSS selectors here. But everything in data can be read as a variable within that application. So if it was data.hello world, then it would be hello world up there. And there's also other ways of putting like methods and doing other things besides data in there that allows you to bind to different things throughout your application. So the way I learned Vue was just this tutorial from Coding Explained. It was pretty good and explained a lot of the concepts and how to do handlers and event handlers and how to do methods, but it did not have that companion GitHub project that I really wanted, like Create React did. So if there's better ones, let me know. But there's no one using Vue.js in here, right? Not yet? Oh, we got a couple. So if you guys know of anything, let me know. I'd love to hear it. So the code, typically, it's similar to Angular, where you can include, right, a script file and start coding away with it. You'll see here, instead of data, we have methods, and then you can call into those methods with v-on. And this v-on is how a lot of the event handling is done with Vue. And you'll call into there, and if you need to pass parameters into there, then instead of having this that already handles it, you have to specify $event, and then you can get to that event and everything about it. So similarly, it has a Vue CLI that you can use, npm install it, and then it has a number of different templates. So it's not just like the other ones where they have one single template. You can see here there's a Webpack one. I think there's a System.js one, so you can choose the different type of build systems you might want to use. Now the biggest difference that they have, here's an example of initting it, is they actually do it really quick because they don't run npm install. Genius. Makes them look really smart and fast. Right? You type that out and then downloads it. You answer a few questions, so that's a little different too. And then you install the Vue router. You pick an ESLint that you want. Then boom, you're done in 16 seconds, right? I barely had to speed that up at all. So all of these have some sort of server-side support. So it used to be called Angular Universal. Now it's been merged into Angular 4, and it depends on the language that you're using as far as the server side, how you actually render these. By server-side support, what happens, whoa, like lost a projector? So this is where it looks good for me, and for you guys, you're like, what's he talking about? There we go. So Angular Universal has been merged in. If you're using Node.js or you're using .NET, they've had good support for actually rendering that on the server. And what that does is it just processes that initial HTML and sends it out, and then it's just like a regular, Angular application. The Spring Boot support is also available, and that's new, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Mobile.twitter.com was recently done with React and Node.js, and it's a progressive web app, and it does the initial processing on the server. It's very fast. They've actually saved somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of their bandwidth by moving to that model and having it, more happen on the server and using React. For Vue, there's a whole project called Nux.js that looks really cool, and it's basically like, you're writing your application in JavaScript, but it's like you're writing time-leaf templates, and then it's rendered, from the server, and it spits it out. So if you're interested in any of those, the thing that I would recommend is investigate them and see if they work with your web framework, because you can make that initial page load just happen that much faster if you start from the server. It might be a little painful to develop that way because not all of these have hot reloading capabilities, especially with the Spring Boot one for Angular, but people are working on them and they'll probably get there. So for React and Spring Boot, there's server-side support from Benjamin Winterberg, software engineer from Germany, and Simon Wachter from Switzerland just created this Spring Boot Angular render. And that only came out in the last couple weeks. I tried it. It works. I would encourage you to try it yourself. They basically use like the Nashorn engine under the covers. So it's basically like calling out to Node and then compiling everything and making that initial page request happen and populating it with data. So commit strip is awesome, and I think they illustrate the problem well. So the challenge in choosing a framework, especially a JavaScript framework, is if you wait too long, you'll get left behind. And then it's like, well, how do you know which one to choose? And then the right train is the real question. So this one's funny because look at vanilla JS, that's just JavaScript in general, is always on time. Right? MooTools was canceled. jQuery is still on time. Prototype's canceled. Backbone's on time. Like some of them are dying. Angular 2, this is a while ago. Maybe late, maybe not. Right? Who knows? And Angular 2 did take longer than expected. But you can always wait like 3 months if you don't like any of these frameworks, and there'll probably be a new one that you'll be able to use. So moving on to CSS, which I think is important to understand. You have CSS selectors, which hash binds to IDs, and then dot whatever binds to classes. And then here is a way of doing any siblings. So blog post sibling anything P will get anything under that blog post. But the colon first is basically a way of doing child selectors, right? The first paragraph. And once you get a lot of those things down, then you might get into sibling selectors. This image is basically saying I have an image tag, and not inside it, but outside of it, next to it, I have a span with a caption class, and I want to style that and give it italics. So you won't use sibling selectors a whole lot. When I've used them, it's because I've been reskinning an existing website, and they didn't want to move any HTML around, and I needed to tweak things and make it look like I wanted. But if you're going to do CSS, I highly recommend you look into Sass, because it's more of a programming environment. It gives you variables. It gives you the ability to nest things, and it still spits out CSS. And most of the processors are fast enough that you can make changes, and it'll instantaneously, reload with Browsersync, and you'll see your changes in there. So it's a really nice way to write CSS. It'll tell you in like IntelliJ whether it actually has errors in it, right, if you're doing it wrong, whether you're doing CSS or Sass, but Sass is definitely a pleasant experience. There's also less, right? That was really popular with Bootstrap 3 and a few other projects, but it's kind of fallen by the wayside. My gut feel is that Sass has really kind of taken over. So the good news is you don't have to write your own CSS. There's these frameworks out there now that really help you with a lot of it. And I tend to think that Bootstrap was kind of what JSF wanted to be. It wanted to be a web component framework that you would just drop in these tags and everything would work. And that's basically what Bootstrap provided us. It gave us the ability to add classes or simple, almost like web components with JavaScript or jQuery behavior, and really made it so a lot of people had a common ground. So one of the things we haven't had in web development versus iOS development is iOS development had like the human guidelines for creating iOS apps, right? And if you followed it, all your iOS apps would look the same. But a lot of people wanted that because they wanted to look like a native app, right? And so Bootstrap kind of gave that. The problem was that all of a sudden everyone's websites looked like they were done in Bootstrap. But it's better than not having anything and not having CSS. So I really like the CSS frameworks. I recommend them. I think Skeleton is one of the best names in their tagline. A dead simple framework. Skeleton, dead simple. Come on, that's funny. Pure CSS is from Yahoo. So that's their version of a CSS framework. This guy down here is from Foundation. And then Bootstrap, which has been very popular for a while. The funny thing about Bootstrap is they announced like Bootstrap 4 a couple years ago. And you can use it, and it's out there, but it's alpha version. So it's not quite like JavaScript frameworks where maybe you want to wait for 1.0. I mean, it's just a bundling of a whole bunch of classes and stuff. So even though it's alpha, I think it's good enough to use, and I've been using it on projects. So Bootstrap really is the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework, or at least that's what they say, right? It's not really a JavaScript framework. It's like got jQuery plugins. But they recommend it if you're building responsive or mobile serve projects on the web. Basically, it allows you to make your buttons look good. So before Bootstrap, everyone had their buttons, the same color, and now they give a primary look to their buttons. So good for Bootstrap for making that happen. They also have a nice grid for laying out your components. So if you've ever struggled with having things in a grid and resorted to tables, now you don't have to. But don't be afraid to use tables, because those really work well. If you just do width equals 100%, you can actually position everything really nicely. And so try with the grid and give it about a half hour, maybe an hour. But at some point, just be like, I'm going to use a table. No one will even know. So CSS Framework Stars on GitHub. You can see that Bootstrap is still by far the most popular. We also have front-end performance optimization. You want to reduce HTTP requests. That's your most important thing. So concatenate your JavaScript files. gzip and expires headers are the #1 thing. I've been with many clients, and this was what we solved problems with. They thought the problem was on the back end with performance. Turned out to be on the front end with expires headers and gzipping. HTTP2 is happening. You should look into using it if you can. With JHipster and Undertow, it's very easy to turn on. We allow you to turn it on with just a property. And you can see here in Chrome Developer Tools, it shows that it's using HTTP2. You can also do HTTP2 server push. So this will actually push an image down to the browser. And when we push that HTML, it doesn't make another request for that image. So that's pretty cool. These are some nice drawings on HTTP2 and HTTPT. Also, Chrome Developers Tools. If you want to follow people on Twitter that are really talking about these tools, I highly recommend Umar Hansa and Adi Osmani. This is a course called Modern Dev Tools that just started. It's like $60 US. So I'm not sure what the conversion rate is, but he's got 3 tutorials out, and he's adding more. But basically, if you want to get good at using Chrome to debug and do performance analysis on your project, it's a great way to do it. There's also a number of framework tools for Angular, for React, and for Vue. Angular is only a Chrome plugin. React actually has a way of turning your, or they have a Firefox plugin, but Vue has a way of making your Chrome browser work like Firefox, or your Firefox browser work like Chrome, and then you can install the Chrome plugin in there. So it's not official support like React, but it is in there. And then lastly, we have progressive web apps. Progressive web apps are basically a web app that can be installed in your browser. And it involves three things. The number one thing is HTTPS. So that's pretty easy to do with Let's Encrypt, right? You can get free SSL certificates now. It uses a service worker to load it offline. Service workers are basically, not that much code that you can put in a JavaScript file. And then it has a web app manifest that says, here's how you install this app. If you're doing web apps, you should try to do mobile-first development. That means you're testing on the smallest device first before your big monitor. If you have a 30-inch monitor and you develop on that, and then you make it look good on a small device, chances are you're hiding a bunch of stuff and it's really heavyweight. And the reason is we failed on mobile because our laptops are filthy liars. So you should actually do development on an Android device, see what it looks like on an Android device. DoubleClick did this report last year, and they found that 53% of devices or visits are abandoned if a site takes more than 3 seconds to load, and 53% of sites took 19 seconds or longer. So be cognizant of that if you're basically developing a mobile application. Implement Purple, get an unlock Android to test, use Lighthouse, which is a Chrome developer plugin that you can actually test your application to see if it's a progressive web app, and use network and CPU throttling. So the purple pattern is push those critical resources, render the initial route, pre-cache the remaining routes, and lazy load. And there's all kinds of tools for all these frameworks to do it for you. And in fact, to do it in Angular and React isn't very different at all, because a lot of these things are outside of the scope of the framework. Service workers are outside of the scope of the framework. So developer.okta.com, I wrote a post last week about doing progressive web apps with Angular. I found a post yesterday about doing it with React, and it's pretty much the same thing. So if you read mine, you'll know how to do it with React. We're getting short on time, so OAuth top 10. Check out JHipster. It allows you to create microservices. I wrote a book on it. It's out of date already, but I plan to update it soon. So it covers AngularJS. It doesn't cover microservices, but I'll be updating it for Angular 4 and for its microservices stuff. So today you learned ES6, you learned TypeScript, learned a bit about Node and NVM, Angular, React, and Vue, CSS and Sass, front-end performance, and a bit about progressive web apps. Be curious. Try. Learn these things, or at least look into it and try one tutorial. And it's great for kids. This stuff is so easy to teach to kids. I highly encourage you to get involved with DevOps for kids. Care about quality. Test your software, because it's pretty easy. The easiest unit test ever. And don't be afraid to try new tools like Jest. Jest is something that the React team uses. It allows you to parallelize all of your tests and everything. And don't be afraid to try new things. If you want to follow me, those are my links. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions, let me know.